the ancient and quiet town of Ulthar, nestled between rolling hills and mist-covered woods, lived a pair of old, bitter souls. Their house, a crooked and crumbling structure, sat at the edge of the village, overgrown with weeds and tangled vines that seemed to choke the very life out of the land around it. The couple was infamous, though no one in town dared speak their names aloud. Everyone knew of their cruel habits, and they were spoken of in hushed tones. For as long as anyone could remember, they had taken a perverse pleasure in the suffering of the creatures that roamed near their property, especially the cats. The town itself had an odd relationship with its feline residents. Cats were revered in Ulthar. They wandered freely through its cobbled streets, darting in and out of homes, curling up on windowsills and lounging in patches of sunlight. To harm a cat in Ulthar was unthinkable. But the old couple at the edge of town cared nothing for such reverence. Any cat foolish enough to wander into their domain met a swift, brutal end. The residents had heard the screams, those terrible, screeching cries that echoed in the night, and many had witnessed the aftermath. The couple would leave the mangled bodies of the poor creatures at the boundary of their property, a warning to others. Yet no one ever dared to confront them. Fear was a powerful silencer, and so the villagers merely kept their cats close, whispering warnings to their children to keep away from the House of Horrors. One evening, as the orange sun sank beneath the horizon and long shadows stretched across the town, a group of strange travelers arrived in Ulthar. Among them was a young orphan boy named Menes, quiet and withdrawn, carrying with him his only companion in the world, a small, fragile kitten with fur as black as night. The travelers sought shelter in the town, staying at the inn for a few days. Menes, with no family to call his own, spent his days with the kitten, who never left his side. Together they wandered the town, exploring its winding alleys and basking in the warmth of the sun. The boy had lost much in his short life, but the kitten brought him solace and a sense of belonging. But Ulthar, with all its beauty, held a dark secret, and that secret soon found its way to Menes. One evening, while the travelers sat together by the fire in the inn, the kitten, curious and playful, slipped away unnoticed. The boy, realizing too late that his beloved companion was gone, searched frantically through the streets, calling its name into the growing darkness. He scoured every corner, every alley, but the kitten was nowhere to be found. The next day, as Menes continued his desperate search, the townsfolk whispered quietly among themselves, casting nervous glances toward the edge of town. It didn't take long for Menes to learn of the old couple and their dreadful ways. His heart sank as he realized what might have become of his kitten. He begged the villagers for help, pleading for someone to confront the old couple, but his cries fell on deaf ears. No one would dare challenge them. Menes was on his own. That night, under a sky heavy with clouds, Menes stood alone at the edge of the couple's property, his heart filled with grief and fury. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the eerie creaking of the old house's decaying wood. With no one to turn to, Menes knelt in the dirt, clutching the small collar of his lost kitten, and whispered a prayer, one not spoken in this world for centuries. His words, ancient and guttural, seemed to twist the air around him. The wind stilled, and the clouds above began to churn unnaturally, swirling as if guided by an unseen hand. Menes' eyes burned with an intense light as he continued his incantation, focusing all his energy, all his grief, into the words that tumbled from his lips. It was a prayer not of forgiveness, but of vengeance. As the night deepened, a strange and suffocating silence descended upon Ulthar. The town's cats, normally restless and active, were nowhere to be seen. They had vanished, all of them. The streets were empty, devoid of the soft pads of their paws and the comforting sounds of their purring. The villagers awoke in confusion, calling out for their pets, but there was no answer. Anxiety swept through the town like wildfire, yet no one dared approach the old couple's house. They feared what they might find. Morning came, gray and lifeless, casting an eerie pallor over the town. And then, as suddenly as they had disappeared, the cats returned. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, their sleek bodies slinking through the streets. But something was different. Their movements were slower, more deliberate. Their eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and their fur seemed unnaturally glossy. The townspeople watched in awe and unease as the cats silently made their way toward the center of the village, where they gathered in a strange, unsettling circle. They sat in unison, staring toward the edge of town, toward the house of the old couple. No one had seen the couple that morning, and a dreadful curiosity began to take hold of the villagers. What had become of them? A small group, led by the town's blacksmith, finally mustered the courage to approach the house. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness as they stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the decrepit home. The door, usually barred shut, hung open, creaking on its rusted hinges. Cautiously, they entered. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The house was eerily empty. Dust coated every surface, and the stench of decay hung heavy in the air. But it wasn't until they reached the back of the house near the garden that they saw it, the sight that would freeze their blood. Lying in the center of the room were two skeletons, their bones gleaming white and picked clean. The remains were twisted and contorted as if the owners had died in great agony. The skulls grinned up at the ceiling in a grotesque mockery of life, their hollow eye sockets staring into the abyss. Around them, the floor was littered with tufts of fur, and the claw marks etched into the wood told the story that the villagers could barely comprehend. The cats had returned with a vengeance. The villagers stood in horrified silence, unable to tear their eyes away from the skeletal remains of the couple who had once terrorized their beloved animals. There was no question about what had happened here. The cats had claimed their revenge, and in the most terrible of ways. Menez, the orphan boy, was never seen again after that night. The travelers had left Ulthar without him, and though some wondered what had become of the boy, none dared ask. Perhaps he had found peace in knowing that justice had been served. From that day forward, no one in Ulthar ever harmed a cat again. The felines roamed freely, their presence a constant reminder of the dark night when vengeance descended upon the town. And though the old couple's house stood abandoned, its door forever creaking in the wind, no one ever dared to go near it again. For in Ulthar it was said, the cats never forget. The cold wind howled against the windows as the group of girls huddled together in the dimly lit living room. It was a typical sleepover. Snacks, gossip, and ghost stories to pass the time while their friends' parents were out for the night. The house, old and creaky, seemed the perfect setting for a spooky night, but none of them could have anticipated how real the horror would become. "So, did you guys hear about the cemetery nearby?" One of the girls, Sarah, began in a low voice. Her face was barely visible in the flickering light of a single candle they had lit for dramatic effect. The girls exchanged glances, curiosity piqued. "What about it?" Jenna, the most skeptical among them, asked, her tone laced with doubt. "There's a grave there," Sarah continued, her voice almost a whisper now, "where they say a man was buried alive just last month. People have reported hearing strange sounds at night, like someone trying to claw their way out of a coffin." The group shivered, more from the suggestion than the chill in the air. The idea of someone trapped underground, helpless and suffocating, stirred their imaginations. One of the younger girls, Emily, pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes wide with fear. "Come on," Jenna scoffed, rolling her eyes. "That's just an urban legend. You really believe that?" "I don't know," said another girl, nervously twirling a strand of her hair. "My brother said he heard something when he walked by the cemetery last week, like scratching and voices." "That's ridiculous," Jenna replied firmly. "There's no such thing as ghosts, and no one is buried alive these days. It's all just to scare people like you." Sarah smirked. "Well, if you don't believe it, why don't you prove it?" Jenna paused, sensing a challenge. "What do you mean?" "I dare you to go to the cemetery," Sarah said, leaning in closer, her eyes glinting with mischief. Go to the grave of the man who's supposedly buried alive and drive a stake into the ground above his coffin. If there's no ghost, you've got nothing to worry about, right?" The room fell silent as the dare hung in the air. Jenna's lips tightened, and she could feel everyone's eyes on her. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not from Sarah, who loved to test her. "Fine," Jenna said after a moment, standing up. "I'll do it. I'll show you how ridiculous this whole thing is." Her friends exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Jenna was bold, but none of them liked the idea of her going to the cemetery alone. But before anyone could protest, she was already grabbing her coat. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, Jenna called over her shoulder as she walked toward the door. "Try not to get too scared while I'm gone." The wind was colder than she'd expected, biting through her clothes as she made her way through the deserted streets toward the cemetery. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. The further she walked, the darker it became, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows that danced in the moonlight. When she reached the cemetery gates, they creaked open with an eerie groan. Jenna hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to stop her. But the streets behind her were empty. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cemetery was old, its gravestones weathered and leaning, their inscriptions faded and barely legible. The air here was still, unnaturally so, and the only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel path. The moon cast a pale glow over the rows of graves, but it offered little comfort. As she approached the grave Sarah had mentioned, she could feel her heart beating faster. The grave was freshly dug, the earth still loose and disturbed. For a moment she thought she heard something, a faint scraping noise from deep beneath the soil, but she quickly dismissed it as her imagination playing tricks on her. Jenna pulled out the stake she had brought, a crude wooden thing she'd found in the shed behind the house, and knelt by the grave. Her breath fogged the air as she gripped the stake in both hands and prepared to drive it into the ground. "This is stupid," she muttered to herself, feeling a wave of embarrassment. "There's nothing here." But as she raised the stake to plunge it into the soil, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the cemetery, rattling the branches of the nearby trees. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. She could have sworn she heard something again. Faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of scratching, of nails clawing at wood. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to finish the dare. She drove the stake into the ground, pushing it deep into the soil above the grave. As soon as the wood pierced the earth, the wind stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the cemetery. For a moment, nothing happened. Jenna stood up, her heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to confirm her doubts. But there was only silence, cold and oppressive. "See?" she said aloud, though her voice sounded shaky. "Nothing." But as she turned to leave, she felt something tug at her coat. Panic surged through her, and she spun around, but there was no one there. The wind had picked up again, swirling leaves around her feet, and in that moment, she realized with horror that she had made a terrible mistake. She tried to move, but her feet wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding her in place, pulling her down toward the grave. She looked down in terror to see that the hem of her coat was caught on the stake she had driven into the ground. In her haste to finish the dare, she had impaled her coat along with the soil. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to free herself, but the more she pulled, the more tangled she became. She fell to her knees, frantically trying to tear the fabric loose, but it was no use. The panic clawed at her throat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then she heard it. A low, guttural voice, like a whisper carried on the wind, drifted up from beneath the ground. Challenge accepted. Jenna's scream was swallowed by the night. Morning came slowly, the sun casting long shadows over the cemetery as it rose. Sarah, Emily, and the others had waited all night for Jenna to return, but as dawn broke and there was still no sign of her, they knew something was wrong. With growing dread, they decided to go to the cemetery to find her. When they arrived, the sight that greeted them made their blood run cold. Jenna lay sprawled on the ground next to the grave, her face pale and lifeless. The wooden stake was driven through her coat and into the earth, but what made their stomachs turn was the position of the stake. It had pierced her chest, driven straight through her heart. Sarah fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached for the stake, and that's when she saw it. Carved into the wood, in small, jagged letters, were the words, "Challenge accepted." None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They could only stare in horror at the tragic proof that some dares were never meant to be accepted. Billy Weaver's journey had begun with the bitter bite of winter winds gnawing at his skin, his coat hardly enough to stave off the chill. The small town, cloaked in a veil of frost, seemed to be deserted at this late hour. He had been walking for what felt like hours, his feet aching from the cold and his patience wearing thin. Just when he thought he might have to sleep outside, he spotted a small boarding house at the end of a quiet street. It looked welcoming, with its warm yellow light glowing through the windows. He hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach it, hoping the place still had room for a weary traveler like himself. The brass doorbell chimed faintly as he pressed it, and within moments the door creaked open to reveal a small, elderly woman. She smiled sweetly at him, her face framed by wiry gray hair, and her eyes gleamed with an odd, almost unnerving warmth. "Come in, dear," she said in a soft, lilting voice. "I've been expecting someone." Billy blinked, puzzled, but chalked it up to small-town hospitality. He stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that enveloped him as he entered. The house was charming, though old-fashioned, its interior filled with floral wallpaper, antique furniture, and the faint scent of something medicinal, like camphor or mothballs. "You must be cold," the woman said, closing the door behind him. "Please, make yourself at home." As she led him to a small desk by the entrance, Billy noticed the eerie quiet of the place. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound, aside from the occasional crackle of the fire from the living room. The woman handed him a guest book to sign, and Billy did so without much thought. But as he was filling in his details, something caught his eye: the names of the previous guests. Christopher Mulholland, Gregory Temple. Billy frowned. Those names rang a bell, though he couldn't quite place where he had heard them before. For a moment, a strange unease settled in his stomach, but he shook it off, attributing his discomfort to exhaustion from his long journey. With his name signed and the necessary details filled out, the woman beamed at him. "Now, come sit by the fire, dear," she said. "Would you like something to eat or drink?" "I'm all right, thank you," Billy replied, his voice stiff from fatigue. "I think I'll head to bed soon." But the old woman was insistent, her hands fluttering around him like a nervous bird. "Just a cup of tea, then. It'll warm you right up." Reluctantly, Billy agreed, and they sat down in the living room, a cozy space with a fire crackling in the hearth. As they sipped tea, Billy's attention drifted to the odd decor of the room. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a dusty parrot cage, though the bird inside it didn't make a sound. In fact, it was eerily still, perched on its bar, its glassy eyes staring vacantly ahead. Near the fire lay a dog, curled up as if asleep, but something about its motionless body made Billy feel uneasy. "Is the parrot all right?" Billy asked, trying to suppress the creeping sensation of dread crawling up his spine. The old woman glanced at the bird and smiled. "Oh, my dear, no," she said matter-of-factly. "Neither the parrot nor the dog are alive anymore. They've been with me for years." Billy felt his stomach turn. His eyes darted back to the dog lying motionless near the fire, and he realized with growing horror that its fur was unnaturally stiff, as if it were a stuffed figure. He suddenly found it hard to swallow, the tea in his cup growing cold in his hand. He tried to mask his discomfort by continuing the conversation. "So, have there been many other guests lately?" Billy asked, his voice now tinged with nervousness. "Oh, yes," the old woman replied with a soft sigh. "There have been a few. Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple were such charming boys. Mr. Mulholland had the most lovely skin, so soft, so perfect." Billy's heart skipped a beat, the names she mentioned triggering a flash of memory. He had read those names somewhere before, recently, in the newspaper. Both men had been reported missing under mysterious circumstances, and now he was sitting in the very house where they had stayed. His mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible realization that was dawning on him. The names, the strange stillness of the animals, the way the old woman spoke of her previous guests, as though they were still present in some way. His pulse quickened, and an icy chill ran down his spine as the fire seemed to grow dimmer, the warmth in the room now feeling oppressive, suffocating. "I think I'd better head to bed," Billy said abruptly, standing up too quickly and nearly spilling his tea. The old woman's smile didn't falter. "Of course, dear," she said sweetly, standing as well. "I've prepared the coziest room for you. Just up the stairs, second door on the left." Billy nodded stiffly, trying to maintain his composure as he made his way up the narrow staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, and his heart pounded in his chest as he reached the door she had mentioned. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The room was small, simple, and perfectly ordinary, except for one thing. In the corner, hanging on the wall above the bed, was a large framed photograph of the old woman with two young men standing beside her, both of them smiling politely. Billy's blood ran cold when he recognized the faces, Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple. His head spun, and the walls seemed to close in on him. He had to get out. He had to leave this place before something terrible happened. He turned to leave the room, but as he reached for the doorknob, he heard the faintest whisper behind him. He froze. Billy. The voice was soft, almost like a breath, but unmistakably close. He turned slowly, his heart thudding in his chest, and his eyes fell on the photo once again. The faces of Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple now seemed to be staring directly at him, their eyes no longer filled with polite smiles, but with something darker, something sinister. Panic surged through him, and Billy rushed out of the room, stumbling down the stairs. He had to leave, had to get out before the nightmare overtook him. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, the old woman was there, standing in the doorway, her smile no longer warm, but cold and menacing. "Where are you going, dear?" she asked softly, her voice like silk over steel. Billy opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thick with a suffocating weight. His legs felt like lead, and his vision blurred as the world around him dimmed. He never made it out. It was a dreary, rain-soaked evening when Sergeant Major Morris arrived at the home of Mr. and Mrs. White, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering flames of the fireplace. The Whites, a humble couple living in the isolated outskirts of town, welcomed Morris with warm smiles. He was an old family friend, though his demeanor had changed in recent years. He carried with him the weight of things seen and done in distant lands, and his eyes, once bright, now seemed haunted. They sat by the fire exchanging pleasantries, while Morris sipped from a glass of whiskey, his hand trembling ever so slightly. It wasn't long before the conversation shifted to the strange relic he had brought with him from India, a shriveled, mummified monkey's paw, its fingers twisted in a grotesque curl. "I've seen some strange things in my time," Morris said, his voice gravely, "but nothing as cursed as this." He placed the monkey's paw on the table between them, its presence seeming to darken the room. Mrs. White shuddered, but Mr. White, ever the skeptic, leaned in closer, intrigued rather than repulsed. "What is it exactly?" Mr. White asked, curiosity overtaking him. Morris's gaze remained fixed on the paw as he explained. "It's a talisman, a cursed one. It has the power to grant 3 wishes to its owner, but those wishes come at a price, a terrible price." Mrs. White glanced at her husband, the unease in her eyes evident. "Why would anyone want something like that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Morris shook his head. "I didn't believe it at first either, but I've seen what it can do. I've seen the consequences. It's dangerous, too dangerous. I've come to warn you, Mr. White, don't take this lightly." But Mr. White, always pragmatic, laughed it off. "Come now, Morris. You don't expect us to believe in old superstitions, do you? It's just a trinket, nothing more." Morris sighed deeply and stood up, leaving the paw on the table. "You may not believe me, but heed my warning. Don't use it. It brings only sorrow." As the night wore on and after Morris had left, Mr. White's curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the monkey's paw, turning it over in his hands. "What harm can it do?" he muttered, half to himself, half to his wife. 3 wishes. It's probably just a harmless superstition. Mrs. White wasn't so sure. "We don't need anything, dear," she said, casting a wary glance at the paw. "Let's just forget about it." But Mr. White's mind was already made up. "I wish for 200 pounds, he said with a smirk, rubbing the paw. For a moment, nothing happened. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled outside, but the paw remained still. Mr. White laughed nervously. "See? Just a silly story." The next day dawned bleak and gray. The sky was overcast, and a cold chill clung to the air. The Whites went about their morning routine, though a sense of unease lingered in the house. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. White answered it, finding a man from Herbert's workplace standing solemnly on the doorstep, his hat in hand and his face ashen. "I'm sorry," the man began, his voice hollow. "There's been an accident at the factory. Your son, Herbert, he didn't make it." Mrs. White's knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor, her wails filling the house. Mr. White stood frozen, his mind reeling with disbelief. The man from the factory handed him a check, compensation for the accident. £200. Exactly what Mr. White had wished for. Days passed, but the grief did not fade. Herbert's funeral was small and somber, the weight of loss pressing down on the Whites like a suffocating fog. Mrs. White, inconsolable, wept constantly, her eyes red and swollen. Mr. White, though equally devastated, kept silent, but the monkey's paw gnawed at his thoughts, the guilt of his wish hanging over him like a dark cloud. Nearly 10 days after the funeral, Mrs. White came to her husband late one night, her face gaunt and pale, her hands trembling. "We have another wish," she whispered, desperation in her voice. "We can wish him back." Mr. White recoiled at the thought. "No, we can't. You don't understand. He's been dead for days, buried in the ground. He won't come back the same." But Mrs. White was inconsolable. "I don't care," she cried. "I want my son back. He's our only child. Please, for me." Against his better judgment and unable to bear the sight of his wife's anguish, Mr. White retrieved the paw from its hiding place. With trembling hands, they made their second wish. "I wish for my son to return." The house fell silent, the air thick with tension. For a long moment, nothing happened. Mr. White let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, half relieved, half dreading what might come next. And then, from somewhere in the darkness outside, came a soft, unmistakable knock at the door. Mrs. White gasped and rushed to the front door, her hands fumbling with the locks. "Herbert!" she cried. "It's him! It's our boy!" But Mr. White's heart raced with fear. He knew what lay beyond that door wasn't the same boy they had buried. He knew that death had already claimed Herbert, and whatever stood on the other side of that door was not his son. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the gentle knock of someone asking for entry. It was a demand, a pounding that reverberated through the house, shaking the very walls. "Don't open it!" Mr. White screamed. But Mrs. White was already pulling at the door, tears streaming down her face. She struggled with the locks, desperate to see her son again, to hold him once more. Mr. White, in a panic, grabbed the paw, knowing there was only one way to stop what was coming. His hands shook violently as he made the third and final wish. "I wish for him to be gone." The pounding on the door stopped. The house fell deathly silent once more. Mrs. White finally managed to unlock the door, flinging it open, but there was no one there. The road outside was empty, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Mrs. White collapsed to the floor, her sobs echoing through the house as she stared at the empty doorway. Her son was gone forever. Mr. White stood motionless, clutching the paw in his hand, his heart heavy with the knowledge that some doors should never be opened, some wishes never made. And as the night wore on, the cursed relic sat on the table once more, its twisted fingers a reminder of the terrible cost of tampering with fate. The night air was thick with humidity, a heavy blanket that clung to every inch of the secluded lovers' lane where Mark and Lisa sat, their car parked in the darkness. The road was lined with towering trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms, casting eerie shadows under the dim light of the moon. The only sounds were the distant hum of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves in the light breeze. It was the perfect spot for teenagers like them, seeking privacy far from the prying eyes of the small town. Inside the car, Mark and Lisa were tangled in a heated embrace, their youthful excitement bubbling over in the intimacy of the moment. The car windows had fogged up, creating a hazy cocoon around them. The radio played softly in the background, an old love song drifting through the speakers. For a few minutes, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. But then, without warning, the radio crackled and cut out. The song abruptly stopped, replaced by static and a low hum. Mark pulled away slightly, glancing at the radio with confusion. Before he could adjust the dial, a voice broke through the static, a stern, authoritative tone that made both of them sit up. "This is an emergency broadcast. We interrupt this program to bring you urgent news. A dangerous individual has just escaped from the state asylum. The man is convicted of multiple murders and is armed. Authorities have described him as tall, gaunt, with a hook for a hand. Please remain indoors and report any sightings to the police immediately." Lisa's heart leapt into her throat. She quickly turned to Mark, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "We need to go. Now." Mark, trying to play it cool, chuckled nervously. "Come on, Lisa. It's probably just some prank they're playing on the radio. We've heard stories like this 1,000 times. Don't tell me you actually believe it." But Lisa wasn't convinced. She glanced out the fogged-up windows, her imagination running wild. The darkness outside felt thicker now, more oppressive. The branches of the trees swayed gently, but in her mind they moved with sinister intent, like they were alive and watching them. "I don't care if it's a prank, Mark. Let's just go." "Please," she begged, her voice more urgent. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. Mark sighed, clearly frustrated. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Lisa. What are the chances some escaped killer is out here? Besides, the radio didn't say where he was. For all we know, he could be miles away." But Lisa was insistent now, her voice rising in panic. "I'm not staying here, Mark. Not after hearing that. Please, just take me home." Seeing the fear in her eyes, Mark finally relented. All right, I'll take you home," he muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and the car's headlights cut through the darkness ahead. Slowly, they backed out of the deserted lane and started down the winding road back to town. The drive was tense. The trees that lined the road seemed to loom closer, their shadows longer, stretching across the asphalt like clawed fingers. Lisa kept her eyes fixed on the side of the road, half expecting to see the shadowy figure of a man standing there, watching them. Mark, though he tried to remain calm, couldn't help but grip the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The silence between them grew thick, interrupted only by the occasional crackle of static from the radio. As they drove, every bump in the road made Lisa jump, her nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that something or someone was out there in the dark, watching them. The thought of the hook, sharp and gleaming, flashed through her mind, sending shivers down her spine. Finally, they reached Lisa's house, a modest home on the outskirts of town. Mark pulled up to the curb, the headlights illuminating the front porch. Lisa let out a small sigh of relief, eager to be inside, where it was safe, where the world didn't feel so suffocating. She quickly gathered her things and reached for the car door. But as she pushed it open, the door wouldn't budge. Frowning, she tried again, but it still wouldn't move. "Mark, the door's stuck," she said, her voice laced with frustration. Mark leaned over to help, but when he glanced down at the handle, his face went pale. "Lisa, wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" she asked, her heart pounding again. Slowly, Mark reached over and touched the door handle, his fingers trembling. When he tugged gently, the door gave way slightly, revealing something metallic hooked onto the inside. Lisa's eyes widened in horror as she leaned forward to see what had caught the door. Hanging from the handle, swaying gently with the movement of the car, was a rusted, blood-stained hook. Lisa screamed, stumbling out of the car, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Mark scrambled out after her, his heart racing in his chest. They both stood frozen, staring at the hook as it dangled from the car door, glinting in the moonlight. The realization hit them like a cold wave. The killer had been there, right there, just inches from them. He had been close enough to touch the car, to leave his calling card, a sinister reminder that they had narrowly escaped something far worse than they could have imagined. Trembling, Lisa turned and ran up the steps to her house, fumbling with her keys as she tried to unlock the door. Mark stood by the car, still staring at the hook, his mind reeling. How close had the killer been? Had he been watching them the whole time? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Finally, Lisa managed to unlock the door and rushed inside, slamming it behind her. She locked it, every bolt and chain, before collapsing against the wall, her chest heaving with fear. Mark stood outside for a moment longer, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He glanced around the dark street, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the night was still, eerily quiet. Too quiet. Without another word, he jumped back into the car and sped off, not daring to look back. As the car disappeared down the road, the faint sound of metal scraping against the pavement could be heard, echoing through the night. In the silence that followed, a figure emerged from the trees nearby, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the darkness. He stepped out of the shadows, his hook glinting as he watched the car disappear into the distance. He had been so close, so very close. But there would be other nights. There would be other lovers. Murlock returned home from the forest, the weight of exhaustion heavy on his shoulders. The long day had taken its toll, but it was more than the physical strain. It was the gnawing dread that had clung to him for days. The cabin, small and isolated, sat against the backdrop of the endless, shadowed woods. Inside, his wife lay motionless, her body racked by violent fits. Murlock could do nothing but watch, helpless. Her skin was clammy and pale, her breath ragged and shallow. Each gasp rattled through the air as her body convulsed in his grasp. Desperately he tried to calm her, to bring her back from the brink, but there was no saving her. The fits worsened until, with one final shudder, she went still. Still. For a long moment, Murlock sat frozen, staring at her lifeless body, the silence of the cabin pressing in on him. His wife, the woman he had shared his life with, was gone. Her face, once so familiar and warm, was twisted in death. As though even in her final moments, she found no peace. He could feel the hollowness settle in his chest, a deep void that swallowed him whole. He didn't cry. Murlock wasn't the kind of man to weep, even in the face of unimaginable grief. He simply sat there, his mind numb and his body heavy with exhaustion. Time passed, though he had no sense of it. The moonlight filtered in through the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the small cabin. Eventually, fatigue overtook him. His body slumped in the chair beside her, and despite the oppressive atmosphere in the room, Murlock's eyes closed. He fell into a restless sleep, unable to keep watch over the body any longer. A sound jolted him awake in the dead of night, a distant, faint cry, almost like the wail of a lost child. Murlock's heart raced as he listened, his eyes scanning the darkened room. The sound came again, louder now, more insistent. He tried to shake off the grogginess, but fear held him rooted in place. The cry pierced the night air, filling the cabin with an unsettling, otherworldly presence. Murlock remained frozen, unable to move as the wail grew louder, closer. The cabin felt colder, the chill seeping into his bones as the sound echoed through the room. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the crying stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. He strained to listen, his heart pounding in his chest. In the stillness, he could hear something else, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, as if something or someone was moving in the darkness. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The sense of dread grew, thickening the air around him. With a trembling hand, Murlock reached for his rifle. He raised it toward the shadows, his finger hovering over the trigger. The silence was unbearable, each second stretching out as the unseen presence seemed to crawl closer. In a moment of panic, he fired, the shot ringing out in the small cabin. The deafening noise did nothing to dispel the thick, suffocating atmosphere. He lit a candle, the flickering flame casting weak light across the room. His breath caught in his throat as the glow revealed something in the corner of the room, something far worse than he could have imagined. A large, shadowy figure hunched over the body of his wife, its eyes reflecting the candlelight in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. The creature's jaws were locked around her neck, its sharp teeth sinking into her flesh. It wasn't an animal, not in any ordinary sense. Its body was sleek and muscular, its fur dark as the night itself, but there was something unnatural about it. The way it moved, the way its eyes glowed, it wasn't of this world. Murlock could only stare in horror as the creature dragged his wife's body across the floor, the sound of its teeth tearing through her neck, filling the air. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled forward, shouting and waving the rifle in a desperate attempt to scare it away. The creature snarled, a deep, guttural sound that made Murlock's blood run cold. It looked at him, its gaze sharp and intelligent, before slinking back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, Murlock stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure if what he had seen was real. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching the darkness for any sign of the creature, but it was gone. He dropped to his knees beside his wife, his hands trembling as he reached for her. Her body was cold, lifeless, but it wasn't just the bite marks on her neck that made his stomach turn. As he leaned closer, he saw something clenched between her teeth, a small, torn piece of the creature's ear. Murloc recoiled in horror. It was the same creature that had just stalked the shadows of his cabin, the same one that had dragged her lifeless body across the floor. But how could she have fought back? She had been dead, lifeless, before the creature even arrived. The realization dawned on him with a sickening clarity. This was no ordinary predator. It was something far darker, something that didn't belong in this world, and it had come for her. But the thought that haunted Murloc most wasn't that the creature had killed his wife. It was the knowledge that it would return. Not for her, but for him. Aubrey had always been a man of reason, a gentleman who believed in the tangible, the logical. His life was structured, predictable, and above all, safe. But that was before he met Lord Ruthven. The encounter, which seemed so inconsequential at first, would unravel the very fabric of Aubrey's existence, plunging him into a world far darker than he could ever have imagined. It all began in London, where Aubrey first crossed paths with Lord Ruthven. There was something about the man, an air of mystery that drew people to him like moths to a flame. Tall, with an aristocratic demeanor and eyes that seemed to pierce through the soul, Ruthven was a figure who commanded attention. Yet, there was something unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on the back of Aubrey's neck stand on end whenever he was near. But despite his unease, Aubrey found himself inexplicably drawn to Ruthven's company. When Ruthven suggested they travel together to Rome, Aubrey hesitated. He had heard whispers about Ruthven, stories of misfortune that seemed to follow in his wake. But Ruthven had a way of dispelling such rumors with his charm, and before Aubrey knew it, he had agreed to accompany him on the journey. Rome, after all, was a city of wonder and history. How could anything sinister come of such an adventure? The trip began well enough, with Ruthven acting as the perfect travel companion. They toured the ancient ruins, dined in fine restaurants, and mingled with the upper echelons of Roman society. Yet Aubrey could not shake the feeling that there was more to Ruthven than met the eye. It was during one of their evenings in Rome that Aubrey stumbled upon a scene that would change everything. He had grown suspicious of Ruthven's late-night disappearances and, one evening, followed him to the home of a mutual acquaintance, a young woman of considerable beauty and innocence. Aubrey watched in horror as Ruthven, with an air of detached cruelty, manipulated and preyed upon her. It was as though he thrived on the corruption of innocence, feeding off the despair he sowed. Disgusted, Aubrey severed his ties with Ruthven and left for Greece, seeking solace in the ancient lands. It was there, amidst the crumbling temples and sunlit shores, that Aubrey found Lantha, a woman of enchanting beauty and grace. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, wild, free, and full of life. Aubrey found himself drawn to her not just by her beauty, but by her spirit. She spoke to him of the ancient legends of Greece, stories of gods and monsters, of curses and immortality. But it was her tales of vampires that captivated him most. "There are creatures," Lantha whispered one evening as they sat beneath the stars. "Beings who feed on the blood of the living. They walk among us, hidden in plain sight. But you can always tell them by their eyes. They never seem to age, never seem to change, and their gaze, it feels as though they see straight into your soul." Aubrey laughed it off at first, dismissing it as local superstition. But the way Lanthe spoke, the fear in her voice, it stirred something deep within him. A few nights later, that fear became all too real. Lanthe was found dead, her body pale and drained of blood, just as the legends described. Aubrey was devastated. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ruthven had something to do with her death, though he had no proof. Against his better judgment, Aubrey resumed his travels with Ruthven. Perhaps it was out of morbid curiosity, or perhaps a deeper force was pulling him back into Ruthven's orbit. They journeyed through the desolate lands of the East, where the sun seemed to cast longer shadows and the nights were filled with an oppressive, suffocating darkness. One fateful evening, they were attacked by bandits. In the chaos, Ruthven was gravely wounded, his body crumpling to the ground as the life ebbed from him. As Ruthven lay dying, he grasped Aubrey's hand with surprising strength. "Swear to me," Ruthven rasped, his eyes locking onto Aubrey's, "that you will tell no one of my death. For 1 year and a day, you must keep this secret." Aubrey, shaken and bewildered, swore the oath, not fully understanding the weight of the promise he had just made. Ruthven's lifeless body was left behind, buried hastily in a shallow grave. Aubrey returned to London, trying to forget the horrors of the past few months. But the memories clung to him like a dark cloud, and Ruthven's dying words echoed in his mind. Months passed, and Aubrey tried to rebuild his life. But as the days wore on, he began to notice a disturbing pattern. Every person who had come into contact with Ruthven had met some tragic fate: accidents, illness, unexplained disappearances. It was as though a curse followed him, a dark shadow that consumed everything in its path. Then, one evening, Aubrey's world was shattered. He attended a grand ball in London, hoping to distract himself from the mounting paranoia. But as he stood amidst the glittering crowd, his blood turned to ice. There, across the room, was Ruthven, alive, healthy, smiling that same unsettling smile. Aubrey's heart raced. How could this be? He had seen him die, had buried him with his own hands, and yet there he was, as if nothing had happened. Worse still, Ruthven had set his sights on Aubrey's sister, a gentle and kind-hearted woman who was the light of his life. Ruthven began courting her and soon after proposed marriage. Aubrey was frantic. He knew what Ruthven was, life though he could not speak the words. The oath he had sworn bound him in silence, trapping him in a nightmare of his own making. Desperation clawed at Aubrey's mind. He wrote a letter to his sister, pouring out his heart, warning her of the danger she was in. But it was too late. The letter did not reach her in time. Ruthven and his sister were married in a lavish ceremony, and on the night of their wedding, tragedy struck. Aubrey's sister was found dead, her body cold and lifeless, her skin as pale as snow. Every drop of blood had been drained from her veins. Ruthven had vanished, leaving behind only the hollow shell of the woman Aubrey had loved most in the world. The horror of it all consumed Aubrey. He had failed. Bound by an oath he should never have taken, he had allowed the monster to destroy everything he held dear. And now Ruthven was out there, somewhere, preying on the innocent, leaving death in his wake. Aubrey's mind shattered under the weight of guilt and terror. He could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. Everywhere he looked, he saw Ruthven's eyes, cold and predatory, watching him from the shadows. In a faraway village called Never Better, nestled between thick forests and a rolling mist that never seemed to lift, lived a boy named Jeremy Johnson. The village was small, isolated, and had its share of strange occurrences, but none were as strange as the story of Jeremy. Since he was a child, Jeremy was haunted by a ghost, a shadowy figure that always lingered near him, whispering in the darkness when no one else could hear. But rather than fear the ghost, Jeremy became friends with it. The spectral presence was his only companion in a world that treated him like an outcast. The villagers of Never Better mocked Jeremy, calling him crazy, a troubled boy who spoke to thin air. They sneered at him in the streets, taunting him for what they couldn't understand. To them, he was just a strange boy with a strange mind. But Jeremy knew better. He knew the ghost was real, though he had never seen its face. It only appeared as a shape in the dark, a soft voice in his ear, but it protected him, warned him of danger, and, at times, filled the loneliness in his heart. Life in Never Better grew darker for Jeremy as he aged, and the ridicules only increased. But then, one day, he met a girl named Ginger. Ginger was different from the other children in the village. She didn't mock him or run away when he told her about his ghostly companion. Instead, she laughed and said, "Well, if you have a ghost friend, I'll just have to meet them, won't I?" Jeremy's life changed that day. Ginger was lively, mischievous, and fearless. She invited Jeremy to join her in a prank on the town baker, who was notorious for being mean-spirited. Together, they snuck into the bakery late at night and rearranged all of his tools and ingredients. The next morning, the baker was baffled when he found flour in his pots and sugar on the floor. Jeremy had never laughed so much in his life. But there was something else about Ginger that made Jeremy uneasy. Though he didn't tell her, the ghost had warned him about her, its voice more urgent than ever, telling him to be careful. Jeremy didn't understand why. Ginger was kind, fun, and daring. She made him feel normal for the first time in his life. Days turned into weeks, and Ginger and Jeremy grew closer. They spent their time together planning more pranks and exploring the old, crumbling corners of the village. It was during one of their adventures that Ginger discovered something chilling in Jeremy's family's bookstore. They found a section of old, dusty books in the back, untouched for decades. One of the books, hidden behind a locked case, had a strange symbol on it, one that Jeremy had seen before. It was the same symbol that appeared in his dreams, the same one the ghost had shown him. The mystery deepened when they stumbled across old newspaper clippings hidden within the pages. The articles were about children who had disappeared from the village over the last century. None of the disappearances were ever explained, and all traces of the missing were erased from memory. It was as if the village wanted to forget they had ever existed. Ginger, ever the adventurer, insisted they investigate further. Jeremy was reluctant, but his ghostly companion urged him on, whispering that this was important, that they needed to uncover the truth. As they delved deeper into the mystery, strange things began to happen. Jeremy's ghost grew restless, appearing more frequently and with a sense of urgency. He would wake up at night to find shadows moving in the corners of his room, whispers growing louder, and the feeling of cold hands brushing against his skin. One night, as Ginger and Jeremy were walking through the village square, they heard the faint sound of children's laughter. It echoed through the foggy streets, chilling them to the bone. But when they turned the corner, there was no one there. Only the mist, thick and suffocating, seemed to follow them wherever they went. The ghost was warning Jeremy now, its voice strained and filled with fear. It told him that the village wasn't safe, that something terrible lurked beneath its surface, something ancient and hungry. Jeremy tried to tell Ginger, but she wouldn't listen. She was too caught up in the thrill of the adventure. Their final clue came when they found an old map hidden inside the mysterious book. It led them to the outskirts of the village, to an abandoned well hidden deep within the forest. The well was ancient, its stones worn and covered in moss. Jeremy could feel the presence of something sinister, something that had been waiting for centuries. The ghost was practically screaming at him now, but it was too late. As they approached the well, the air grew colder, and the sky seemed to darken unnaturally. Ginger leaned over the edge of the well, peering into the darkness below. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the shadows and grabbed her wrist. She screamed as she was pulled towards the well, her body twisting in unnatural ways. Jeremy tried to pull her back, but the force was too strong. In an instant, Ginger was gone, dragged into the abyss. Jeremy collapsed, shaking with fear. The ghost appeared beside him, its voice no longer calm, but filled with despair. It told him the truth, that the village had been cursed long ago, and the well was a gateway to something far worse than death. The missing children hadn't disappeared. They had been taken, sacrificed to whatever lurked beneath the well. But the worst part was yet to come. As Jeremy stood there, frozen in horror, he heard Ginger's voice. It was soft, pleading, calling to him from the depths of the well. "Jeremy, help me, please." Her voice grew louder, more desperate. But the ghost warned him not to listen, telling him that it wasn't Ginger anymore, that the well had taken her, body and soul. Jeremy knew he should run, but he couldn't leave her. He leaned over the edge of the well, peering into the blackness, and then he saw it, Ginger's face, pale and twisted, staring up at him from the shadows. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "Come with me, Jeremy," she whispered, her voice no longer her own. "Come join us." With a scream, Jeremy stumbled back, running as fast as he could through the forest, the sound of Ginger's voice echoing in his ears. The ghost followed him, its presence now a protective shield as the village's dark secrets began to close in on him. Jeremy never returned to the well, but the village of Never Better was never the same again. Children continued to vanish, one by one, until the village was nothing but empty streets and haunted memories. Jeremy left the village, but he could never escape the ghost or the well. The voices still call to him in the dead of night, reminding him of what he lost, and what still waits deep in the darkness for him to return. We lived in a modest old house, a place that had stood for decades, its wooden floors creaking beneath every step, its dimly lit corners steeped in shadows. My wife and I lived there quietly, sharing the space with our beloved black cat, Pluto. There was something comforting about his presence, his soft purring, his gentle gaze, the way he would curl up on my lap in the evenings as we sat by the dim glow of the fire. In those moments, life seemed simple, peaceful even. Pluto was more than just a pet. He was a companion, a friend who seemed to understand me in a way that few did. I cherished him. But there was a darkness in me that I could not control, a darkness that only grew stronger with time. My temper was quick to rise, and the bottle became my closest confidant. It was on those nights, with the haze of alcohol clouding my mind, that my affection for Pluto turned into something twisted. I don't remember the exact moment when it began, but I started resenting the cat. His presence, once comforting, became a silent judgment. His eyes, once filled with trust, now seemed to pierce through me, a constant reminder of the man I was becoming. It was one of those nights, one of many, when the alcohol had dulled my senses, that I did something unforgivable. Pluto had crossed my path, innocently brushing against my legs, but in my drunken rage, it felt like a provocation. My hands acted before my mind could stop them. I grabbed the cat, his soft body writhing in my grip, and in a horrifying act of cruelty, I hung him. His lifeless body swung before me, the once comforting purring now replaced by the terrible silence of death. In that moment, I felt nothing but numbness. It wasn't until the next day, when the fog of my drunkenness lifted, that the weight of my actions crushed me. Guilt gnawed at my insides, but it was too late. Pluto was gone, and with him, the last shred of my humanity. Not long after Pluto's death, something strange happened. Our house, our home, was engulfed in flames. The fire came suddenly, violently, and we barely escaped with our lives. Everything was lost, every belonging consumed by the ravenous flames. But as I stood there, staring at the charred remains, one thing stood out. Amidst the ruins, one wall had miraculously survived the fire, and on that wall was an image I would never forget, a haunting imprint of Pluto, his body twisted and hung just as I had left him. The sight chilled me to my core. How could this be? How could the fire, which had devoured everything else, leave behind this grotesque reminder of my sin? I tried to convince myself that it was some trick of the mind, some cruel coincidence, but deep down, I knew the truth. Pluto's death had cursed me, and I would never escape it. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of guilt pressed down on me like an iron shackle. My wife noticed the change in me, though she said nothing. She, too, had loved Pluto, but we never spoke of him again. Life, for all its attempts to return to normal, was forever altered. It was on one of those dark, lonely evenings that I stumbled into a dingy bar, trying to drown the whispers of guilt that echoed in my mind. That's when I saw it. Sitting by the door, half hidden in the shadows, was a cat, a black cat, eerily similar to Pluto. But there was something different about this one. A small white patch marked its chest, a slight deviation from the all-black fur of my former pet. I don't know why I did it, but I brought the cat home. Maybe I thought it would ease the guilt, maybe I saw it as a second chance, or perhaps it was Pluto's spirit calling me back to face my wrongdoings. My wife was hesitant at first, but the cat quickly won her over, just as Pluto had all those years ago. Yet, for me, the new cat was no comfort. Every time I looked into its eyes, I saw Pluto staring back at me. Accusing, haunting. It followed me everywhere, its silent presence a constant reminder of the sin I could never escape. The guilt festered, growing into something dark and monstrous inside me. One evening, as my wife and I descended the cellar steps, the cat darted between my legs, causing me to stumble. In that moment, all the rage, all the guilt, everything I had been suppressing came boiling to the surface. I reached for the cat, my hands shaking with fury, ready to end it once and for all. But my wife intervened, grabbing my arm, pleading with me to stop. In the chaos of the moment, my anger turned on her. I hadn't meant to hurt her, but the force of my rage was uncontrollable. She fell, her body crumpling at the bottom of the stairs. The silence that followed was deafening. My wife, my dear, innocent wife, was dead. Panic set in. I couldn't let anyone find out. In a fit of desperation, I hid her body inside one of the walls in the house. I plastered over it, sealing away my crime, just as I had sealed away my guilt. The cat watched me the entire time, its unblinking eyes following my every move. Days passed, and the police came to investigate her disappearance. I was careful, calm, playing the part of the grieving husband. I thought I had gotten away with it. But on the final day of the investigation, as the officers prepared to leave, a noise erupted from behind the walls, a loud, persistent cry like that of a cat in distress. The officers froze, their eyes locking on the wall I had so carefully sealed. They began to tear it down, brick by brick, until the horrific truth was revealed. There, entombed within the wall, was the rotting body of my wife, her face twisted in death. And beside her, curled up and very much alive, was the cat, grinning, meowing, its eyes burning with a malevolent glow. It was as if the cat had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to face the consequences of my sins. I screamed, my mind unraveling as the weight of everything came crashing down. The officers dragged me away, but I knew I would never escape. Pluto, or whatever dark spirit inhabited that cursed cat, had exacted its revenge. And as I was led away in chains, I could still hear its meowing, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Dolores had always been a girl with a flair for the dramatic. Her giant beehive hairdo was her crown, a statement of her individuality that she maintained with almost obsessive devotion. After graduating high school, she moved into a small, cramped apartment, thrilled at the prospect of living alone for the first time. But the thrill quickly faded as she struggled to pay rent and buy groceries. Still, she made sure to set aside a few bucks for her hair, her pride and joy. Every week, she would visit her hairstylist, Gina, who spent hours perfecting the towering masterpiece atop Dolores's head. "You've got to keep it healthy," Gina would remind her. "No washing too often, use this special spray, and never sleep on your back." Dolores followed the instructions meticulously, convinced that her hairdo was her ticket to popularity, beauty, and maybe even love. But one morning, just as the sun's rays filtered through her thin curtains, Dolores awoke with an unbearable itch at her scalp. She scratched frantically, wincing as a sharp pain pierced her skin. It felt as though a fire ant had made a home in her hair, and panic began to set in. After a quick inspection in the mirror, she was horrified to discover red, swollen bumps dotting her scalp. Desperate to find relief, Dolores turned to home remedies. She tried everything: tea tree oil, vinegar rinses, even aloe vera gel. Yet, the itch only worsened, spreading down her neck and into her ears. After a sleepless night, she finally realized the culprit: a spider bite. Gritting her teeth, she called an exterminator, convinced that the issue was a spider infestation. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," the exterminator reassured her, spraying a thick mist around her apartment. But after he left, the pain persisted, and Dolores found herself sobbing in frustration. "What now?" she muttered to herself. Her hair was beginning to feel like a curse. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She stormed out of her apartment, determined to visit Gina for immediate help. The salon buzzed with chatter and laughter as she pushed through the door, but her heart sank when she saw the line of clients waiting for attention. "Dolores, wait your turn," Gina called from across the room, but Dolores was having none of it. In a moment of impulsive rage, she shoved a middle-aged woman from the salon chair. "I need you now," she declared, her voice shaking with desperation. Gina looked shocked but grabbed her tools and moved toward Dolores. "You really shouldn't." But Dolores couldn't hear her over the roaring sound of her own heartbeat. As Gina began to unwrap the beehive, a sudden chill swept through the salon. Dolores felt something crawling on her neck. She flinched but couldn't bring herself to look. The world around her faded, and she was consumed by the anticipation of relief. Then horror struck. A black widow spider scuttled down her cheek, followed by another and another. Panic erupted in the salon as clients shrieked and scrambled for the exits. Gina stumbled back, her hands trembling as she dropped her comb. "Oh my God, Dolores!" The beehive hairdo, once her pride, now became a grotesque nest. The spiders poured out in waves, black and glossy against her pale skin. Dolores sat frozen in the chair, her eyes wide with terror, as more spiders spilled over her face, their tiny legs tickling her skin with a sinister purpose. In the chaos, the hairspray and product meant to protect her now served as a suffocating cocoon, trapping the creatures within. It became a macabre scene as the hairspray glistened under the fluorescent lights, a sticky trap for the black widows that had taken up residence in her scalp. Gina, horrified, tried to yank Dolores out of the chair, but it was too late. The beehive collapsed and the spiders scattered across the floor, filling every corner of the salon. Clients were screaming, chairs were overturned, and mirrors shattered as everyone rushed for the exit. desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before them. Dolores's heart raced as she felt the swarm enveloping her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't move. Instead, she sat paralyzed, an unwilling host to the horrors crawling beneath her once majestic hairdo. Gina finally turned back, her face pale with terror, and the sight before her was enough to haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Dolores's scalp was a grotesque landscape, half-eaten by the hungry black widows, their tiny bodies writhing in the mess of hair and skin. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Dolores was not just suffering, she was a living nightmare. In the end, Dolores's desperate pursuit of beauty had led her to a horrifying fate. The salon, once a place of laughter and camaraderie, transformed into a scene from a horror film, a reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of even the most glamorous facades. And as the screams faded into the night, the beehive that had once defined her beauty became her tomb, a silent testament to the price of vanity. The smell of damp wood and dust filled the air as Peter and Dennis rummaged through the old basement of their great-uncle's home. The two brothers had been tasked with clearing out the house after their great-uncle passed away, and while most of the items in the basement were nothing more than forgotten relics of the past, one object caught their attention. In the corner, half covered by a worn sheet, was a peculiar toy, a clapping monkey. Its fur was matted and gray, its symbols tarnished, but its eyes gleamed with an unsettling life. The boys stared at it for a moment, the toy's grinning face staring back at them before Peter reached out and picked it up. As he did, a faint creaking sound echoed through the basement, almost like the house itself was groaning in protest. "Hey, look at this!" Peter said, turning the monkey in his hands. "It's so old. Do you think it still works?" Dennis hesitated. There was something about the toy that made his skin crawl, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "I don't know. Maybe we should just leave it," he muttered, glancing around the dimly lit basement, feeling a strange sense of unease. Peter ignored his brother's apprehension and wound the key on the monkey's back. The mechanism inside clicked and whirred to life, and then, with a sudden jolt, the monkey's arms began to move. The cymbals clapped together with a metallic ring that echoed unnervingly in the small space. Clap! 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 The brothers watched in silence, but as the clapping slowed to a stop, the air seemed to shift, growing colder. A gust of wind swept through the basement, though no windows were open, and Dennis could have sworn he heard a faint whisper like someone calling out from far away. That night, their father, Hal, sat at the kitchen table, his face pale as he stared at the monkey that now sat on the counter. He had found it earlier that evening, left carelessly on the kitchen counter by Peter. Seeing it again sent a shiver down his spine, stirring memories long buried. "Where did you find this?" Hal asked, his voice tight with unease. "In the basement," Peter replied, shrugging. "Why? It's just an old toy." Hal's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. "It's not just a toy," he whispered, his eyes darkening. "It's cursed." The brothers exchanged confused glances, but Hal's expression was one of pure fear. Slowly, he began to tell them about his own childhood, about how he had found the same monkey in his father's cupboard when he was just a boy. My father, your grandfather, he disappeared when I was young. One day, he just vanished. No one ever found him. But before he disappeared, I found that damn monkey. And then the clapping started. Every time it clapped, someone in our family died." Dennis felt his stomach drop. "That's impossible," he stammered. "It's just a toy." Hal shook his head. "I wish it were. But it's real. I saw it happen, one by one. My uncle, my aunt, and then my own father." His voice trembled as he recalled the events of the past. "After my father disappeared, I was so terrified of that thing that I threw it down the deepest well I could find, hoping to bury it forever. But now it's back." The room was thick with tension. The sound of the ticking clock on the wall, the only noise breaking the silence. Hal stood up abruptly, grabbing the monkey with shaking hands. "This time, I'll make sure it's gone for good." The next day, Hal drove the boys to a secluded lake a few miles from the house. The water was dark and still, the surface reflecting the overcast sky. Without a word, Hal hurled the monkey into the lake, watching as it disappeared beneath the murky water. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the ripples that spread across the surface before turning to his sons. "It's over," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed a lingering fear. But it wasn't over. A few days later, a headline in the local newspaper caught Hal's attention: "Mysterious death of fish in local lake." Every single fish had been found floating lifeless on the surface, as if something had poisoned the water. Hal's heart sank as he read the article, the weight of dread settling deep in his chest. The curse wasn't gone, it had merely shifted. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, a sudden noise echoed through the house. Clap! 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 The sound was faint but unmistakable. Hal froze, his fork slipping from his hand. The boys looked at each other, fear creeping into their expressions. "It's back," Peter whispered. Hal rushed to the source of the noise, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst into the living room where the sound had come from, but there was nothing, no monkey, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then it came again, louder this time. Clap! 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 The sound echoed through the house, as if the walls themselves were amplifying the cursed rhythm. Hal searched every room, every corner, but there was no sign of the monkey. Yet the clapping continued, relentless, like a countdown ticking towards something inevitable. The next morning, tragedy struck. Dennis had gone out for a morning walk near the woods, but he never returned. His body was found hours later, lying cold in the underbrush, his face twisted in terror. There were no signs of injury, no explanation for his sudden death, except for the faint sound of clapping that Hal swore he could still hear echoing in the distance. Days turned into weeks, and the clapping persisted, sometimes distant, sometimes close, but always there, an ever-present reminder of the curse that had plagued Hal's family for generations. Each time it sounded, Hal would brace himself, waiting for the next tragedy to strike. It wasn't long before Peter fell ill. Doctors couldn't explain his sudden, rapid decline. Hal knew what was coming, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. The curse had taken hold once more, and no matter how far he ran, no matter where he tried to hide the monkey, it would always find its way back. Late one night, as Peter lay on his deathbed, Hal sat by his side, holding his son's hand, his heart breaking. The clapping had grown louder now, almost deafening, as if the cursed toy was mocking him, reminding him of its power. As the last breath escaped Peter's lips, Hal heard the final clap. The house fell silent, the curse seemingly satisfied. At least for now. Hal knew deep down that it wouldn't be the last time. The monkey was out there, waiting, biding its time, and it wouldn't stop until every last member of his bloodline was gone. In the heart of a bustling college campus, two best friends, Meg and Samantha, shared a small dormitory room that held countless late-night study sessions and whispered secrets. Their bond was unbreakable, each relying on the other to navigate the tumultuous waters of college life. As midterm exams approached, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Meg was determined to excel, while Samantha felt the pull of social obligations. One Friday night, Samantha received an invitation to a party. "You should come with me," she urged, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I can't," Meg replied, her voice firm yet laced with disappointment. "I have to study. These exams are important." "Fine, but I'll be back early," Samantha promised, grabbing her jacket and rushing out the door, leaving Meg surrounded by textbooks and highlighters. The night wore on, and Meg buried herself in her notes, the quiet hum of the dorm a comforting backdrop. Meanwhile, Samantha danced and laughed, losing herself in the rhythm of the party, unaware of the dark shadows lurking beyond her cheerful demeanor. When she finally returned to the dormitory, she noticed the lights were off. "Meg must be asleep," she whispered to herself, careful not to disturb her friend. She tiptoed past the common area, her heart still racing from the excitement of the night, and opened the door to their room. The darkness enveloped her, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine as she reached for her bedside lamp. But she hesitated. Meg had always been sensitive to light when sleeping, so Samantha opted to leave it off. Early the next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Samantha woke with a start, her mind buzzing with thoughts of their impending exams. She turned to Meg, ready to discuss study plans, but her friend lay unusually still. "Meg, wake up! We need to go over the material," Samantha called, shaking her friend gently. There was no response. A pit formed in her stomach as she leaned closer, brushing Meg's hair away from her face. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. Meg's face was an unsettling shade of black and blue, her features twisted in an unnatural way. Samantha recoiled in horror, stumbling back and crashing to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. "Oh my God, no! Meg!" she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a frantic storm of confusion and dread. Samantha's gaze darted around the room, taking in the chaos. Meg's study table was a mess. Papers scattered, books thrown to the side as if someone had been searching for something. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as she noticed something peculiar on the wall. With trembling hands, Samantha stood and approached the note, her heart racing. It was scrawled in a jagged handwriting that sent shivers down her spine. "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?" The realization hit her like a freight train. The murderer had been in the room with Meg while she was studying, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Samantha felt a wave of nausea crash over her as she pieced together the horrifying puzzle. A scream bubbled up inside her, desperate to escape, but it was swallowed by the enormity of the situation. She could hardly breathe as the truth settled in her gut. She had been so close, so unaware. Panic set in as she stumbled back from the wall, frantically reaching for her phone. She dialed 911, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. The operator's voice cut through her haze, but the words felt distant, muffled by the reality of what had just occurred. As she waited for help to arrive, every noise in the room felt amplified. The rustle of her clothes, the thumping of her heart, the sound of her shallow breaths. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone, that the darkness that had consumed her friend still lingered, waiting to strike again. Samantha collapsed on the floor, the weight of grief and fear crushing her. How could this happen? How could she have been so oblivious? The memories of laughter and late-night talks flooded her mind, only to be shattered by the grim reality of the moment. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, paralyzed by shock, until the sound of sirens pierced the silence. The flashing lights illuminated the hallway outside, bringing with them the promise of help and the horror of the truth. When the authorities finally entered the room, they found Samantha huddled in the corner, her face pale and haunted. They moved quickly, assessing the scene, their trained eyes catching every detail. The words on the wall were examined, the mess cataloged, and Meg's lifeless form was handled with the utmost care. Samantha watched through a haze of disbelief as they worked, feeling as if she were in a nightmare from which she could not wake. The realization that the darkness had infiltrated their lives, that a predator had lurked in their sanctuary, left a scar on her soul. The police asked her questions, their voices echoing in her mind, but all she could think of was Meg, her laughter, her dreams, their friendship. The world around her faded into a blur as the reality of loss settled in, leaving behind a hollow ache that would never truly heal. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light on the room that had once held so many memories, Samantha understood that this day would forever be etched in her mind. It was the day her life changed irreversibly, the day darkness seeped into the light, leaving only shadows behind. For as long as I could remember, I had been haunted by a recurring nightmare. Each night it would come, slowly building, shifting in small but unnerving ways, as though the dream itself was growing with me. The scene was always the same. I was visiting a friend's house, and everything about his family felt off. There was an aura of menace that I couldn't quite place, a heaviness that pressed down on me every time I stepped through the door. But the centerpiece of these nightmares was always the same woman, Mrs. Stone, the mother of my friend. She radiated an unsettling energy, her eyes cold and predatory, her smile far too wide. Each night, Mrs. Stone would assign me to sleep in a dreadful room, high up in a tower that loomed over the rest of the house. The room was suffocating, the walls damp and moldy, and the air thick with the stench of decay. The bed, an ancient four-poster draped in tattered curtains, sat like a throne in the middle of the room, waiting for me. And I could feel it. The presence that lingered there, watching, waiting. In my waking life, the dream was nothing more than an oddity, a curiosity that I couldn't shake, though it left me unsettled. The characters in the dream morphed and grew with time, their faces sometimes blurring into unrecognizable forms, but Mrs. Stone was always there, her cold gaze never leaving me. The dream grew more vivid with each passing year, and the dread it instilled in me began to creep into my daily life. Then, one night, the dream took a darker turn. Mrs. Stone died. I stood there, watching as her body was lowered into the ground, the earth swallowing her whole. But even in death, she remained a part of the nightmare. Night after night, her pale, lifeless form would rise from the grave, still assigning me to that same awful room in the tower. Her presence grew stronger, more malevolent, as though death had only sharpened her hunger. The dreams continued, but I did my best to push them aside. They were just that. Dreams. Or so I thought. One evening, my friend Clinton invited me to his house for dinner. I hadn't seen him in years, and the chance to reconnect was a welcome distraction from the ever-growing unease that clung to me. As I arrived at his home, a strange chill settled over me. The house was eerily similar to the one from my nightmares. It wasn't an exact match. Some details were different, but the resemblance was uncanny. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. Dinner was pleasant, and Clinton's family seemed normal enough, nothing like the warped versions of themselves from my dream. His mother, though kind and soft-spoken, didn't share Mrs. Stone's icy demeanor. Still, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of my mind, warning me that something wasn't right. As the night wore on, the sky darkened, and a sudden storm rolled in. Clinton's mother, concerned about the worsening weather, suggested I stay the night. "We have a spare room upstairs," she offered. "Why don't you stay until the storm passes?" The words sent a shiver down my spine, and when Clinton led me to the room, my heart sank. It was the room, the same one from my nightmares. The bed, the towering walls, the oppressive atmosphere, it was all there. I stared at Clinton in disbelief. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. "I've seen this room before," I whispered, barely able to process what was happening. My pulse quickened, a creeping sense of dread crawling over me. Trying to dismiss my fear as irrational, I stepped into the room. As I looked around, something caught my eye, a portrait hanging on the wall. It was Mrs. Stone, the woman from my dreams. Only this, Mrs. Stone looked even older, her eyes sunken and hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smirk. I felt an overwhelming urge to take the painting down, to remove it from the room. I called Clinton for help, and together we lifted the portrait from the wall. As we carried it out into the hallway, I felt something warm and sticky under my fingertips. I glanced down, my breath catching in my throat. Our hands were covered in blood. There were no cuts, no injuries, yet the thick red liquid coated our skin. Clinton's face went pale. "What the hell?" he muttered, wiping his hands on his shirt, but the blood wouldn't come off. It seemed to seep into our very skin, no matter how hard we scrubbed. A deep sense of unease settled over us both. Clinton suggested we leave the painting in the hall and go to bed, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. I lay there, my heart pounding, every creak of the old house sending a jolt of fear through me. Hours passed in agonizing silence, my body frozen in place when suddenly I felt it. Something was in the room with me. The air grew thick, oppressive, and a chill seeped into my bones. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of the bed, was Mrs. Stone. Not the portrait, not the dream, but the real Mrs. Stone, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed with a cold, unearthly light. She grinned, her teeth sharp and glistening in the dim light. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice like the hiss of a snake. I scrambled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "You can't be real," I stammered, but deep down I knew she was. This was no dream. "You've been marked," she said, her grin widening. "And now it's time for you to join me." I leapt from the bed, desperate to escape, but Mrs. Stone moved faster than I could have imagined. She was on me in an instant, her cold fingers wrapping around my throat. Her strength was inhuman, and as I struggled against her, I could feel my energy draining, my life slipping away. She leaned in close, her lips brushing against my ear. "You will never escape me." With a final surge of strength, I managed to break free, stumbling out of the room and into the hallway. Clinton burst from his room, his eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" he shouted, but before I could answer, we both froze. The portrait, The one we had moved to the hall was back on the wall in the room, and this time Mrs. Stone's eyes seemed to follow us, her painted lips curling into a sneer. "We need to get out of here," I gasped, grabbing Clinton by the arm. We raced down the stairs, the house groaning and creaking around us as if it were alive, as if it were trying to trap us inside. We fled into the night, the storm raging around us, and didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. Breathless and shaking, we collapsed onto the wet ground, neither of us daring to look back. The next morning, an old newspaper caught our attention. The headline chilled me to the bone. Mrs. Stone's coffin found erupted again. Local authorities perplexed. It detailed the strange occurrences surrounding her grave, how the coffin had been found above ground several times, despite being buried deep. It was then that I knew. This was no coincidence. Mrs. Stone had never been at rest, and now she had marked me. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, I would never be free from her ghostly grasp. On a cold winter night, Emily found herself home alone for the very first time. Her parents had gone out for the evening, leaving her with the comforting presence of her loyal golden retriever, Max. Emily felt both excited and nervous, enjoying the independence but also keenly aware of the unsettling quiet that comes with being alone. She carefully locked all the doors and windows in the house, except for one, the window in her bedroom that never seemed to close all the way, no matter how hard she tried. She shrugged it off, figuring that the cold wind outside wouldn't make it past her thick curtains. As she settled into bed, Max curled up at her feet, and she let the soft murmur of the evening news keep her company. The anchor's voice grew serious, warning viewers about a dangerous individual who had been spotted in the area. Emily's nerves kicked in as she listened to the report, which urged people to stay alert and secure their homes. Shivering slightly, she double-checked the lock on her bedroom door before slipping under the covers. Sleep came in short bursts, but around midnight, a strange dripping sound pulled her from her uneasy slumber. Groggy and confused, she listened for a moment, her heartbeat quickening. The noise echoed faintly, its source unclear. She told herself it was nothing, just the plumbing or maybe a leaky faucet. Trying to reassure herself, she reached down from her bed to give Max a comforting pat. Feeling the warm touch of his tongue against her fingers calmed her, and she lay back down. The dripping sound persisted, however, nagging at her until she could no longer ignore it. Determined to find the source, Emily slid out of bed and tiptoed through the dark house. She checked the taps in the kitchen, the bathroom, even the laundry room. Nothing was leaking. Puzzled, she returned to her room, her fear creeping back. She reached out to Max once again, feeling that familiar lick, and the steady rhythm of the dripping noise lulled her back into a fitful sleep. Morning light streamed through her bedroom window, waking her abruptly. She stretched, trying to shake off the eerie feelings from the night before. Calling for Max, she expected him to hop up, tail wagging as usual. But he didn't. "Max?" she called out again, more urgently. No response. Her stomach knotted with worry. Panicking now, she searched the house, calling for her dog. Her voice grew more frantic with every step. She checked under the bed, the living room, and finally moved toward the closet, her last hope. As she opened the door, Emily's world froze. There, hanging upside down, was Max's lifeless body, blood dripping slowly onto the floor in a steady rhythm. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and shaking. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror, when something else caught her attention. Written on the inside of the closet door in smeared red letters was a chilling message: "Humans can lick too." The horrifying realization gripped her. The comforting licks she'd felt during the night hadn't come from Max at all. Her skin crawled and her heart raced as she frantically dialed 911, her hands trembling so violently she could barely press the buttons. As she waited for help to arrive, the house no longer felt like her home. It felt like a cage, one where something sinister had entered unnoticed. And as the sirens echoed in the distance, Emily was haunted by the truth. Whatever had been in her room that night hadn't left. It was still out there, watching, waiting for the next moment she let her guard down. Bert and Vicky were driving through the desolate, open roads, headed toward California. The plan was to start fresh, find better work for Bert, and leave behind their troubled life in the Midwest. But the journey was anything but peaceful. They bickered constantly, their strained relationship boiling over in the cramped confines of the car. "Maybe if you hadn't pushed me to quit, we wouldn't be in this mess," Bert muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Vicky glared at him. "Oh, please. It's always my fault, isn't it? Maybe if you actually took responsibility." Their argument was abruptly cut off by a sudden flash in the road, a figure darting out from the cornfields that lined the highway. Bert slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The impact was immediate and brutal, the car shuddering as it hit the boy, his small body tumbling onto the asphalt behind them. For a moment, they sat in stunned silence. Then Vicky screamed. "Oh my God, Bert! You hit him!" she yelled, her voice trembling with panic. "It wasn't my fault," Bert snapped back, though the fear in his eyes was evident. "He came out of nowhere." They both scrambled out of the car, rushing to the boy's lifeless body. As they got closer, Bert noticed something disturbing. The boy's throat had already been slit, a deep gash running across it, and he was bleeding heavily. He was already hurt," Bert whispered, feeling a wave of cold terror wash over him. Vicky's eyes widened as she bent down and noticed something in the boy's small bag, a crude cross made entirely of corn husks, twisted and knotted together. She picked it up gingerly, an unsettling feeling creeping over her. "We need to get help," Bert said, his voice tight with fear. "There's a town nearby, Gatlin. We'll take him there." They hurried back to the car, leaving the boy's body behind as they sped toward the eerie, isolated town of Gatlin. The road seemed to narrow as they approached, the cornfields on either side growing unnervingly tall, casting long, shifting shadows across the road. When they finally reached Gatlin, the town appeared frozen in time. The gas station sign advertised prices from decades ago, and the buildings looked abandoned, their windows coated in dust. Yet there was an unsettling feeling that they weren't truly alone. "Something's not right here," Vicky whispered, her eyes darting around. Bert pulled up in front of a small church, its doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to find someone." Vicky watched him disappear inside, her heart pounding. She sat in the car, anxiously scanning the streets, feeling the weight of the oppressive silence. Then she saw them. Children, emerging silently from the cornfields, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and blank. "Bert!" she screamed, but it was too late. The children swarmed the car, their small hands yanking her from the seat. Vicky fought and kicked, but they were relentless, dragging her toward the center of the town. Bert heard her cries and rushed out of the church, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The children had Vicky, their eyes devoid of emotion, as they beat her with wooden sticks. Bert yelled, charging at them, but as he neared, the children scattered into the cornfields, disappearing into the shadows. Vicky was gone. Bert's heart pounded in his chest as he frantically searched for her, his mind spinning. The town felt like a trap, an endless maze of dilapidated buildings and thick, looming corn. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the town seemed even more deserted than before. Desperate, Bert ran into the cornfields, the stalks towering over him like walls closing in. He called for Vicky, but there was no response, only the eerie rustling of the corn in the wind. Finally, as dawn began to break, Bert stumbled upon a horrifying sight. Vicky, tied to a cross made of weathered wood in the middle of the field. Her lifeless body hung limply, her eyes missing, her face twisted in agony. The barbed wire that held her in place gleamed in the early morning light. Bert's legs gave out beneath him as he collapsed in horror. He had lost her. The cornfields, which had once seemed so ordinary, now felt like the heart of something far more sinister. Before he could process the horror of what he was seeing, a deep rumble began to shake the ground beneath him. Bert looked up in terror as something massive began to stir in the corn. The stalks rustled violently, parting to reveal a towering figure, its eyes glowing red like embers in the night. It was a monster, an ancient, hulking creature that seemed to rise from the very soil itself, its body twisted and gnarled like the roots of the corn. Bert tried to run, but the creature's presence was suffocating, pulling him back toward it as if the earth itself were holding him down. The children emerged from the corn once more, watching in eerie silence as the monster approached Bert. Its massive hands reached out, gripping him with inhuman strength. Bert's screams echoed through the fields as the creature tore him apart, his blood soaking into the soil, nourishing the corn that grew in endless rows around him. The children, their faces emotionless, bowed their heads in reverence to the ancient being they called He Who Walks Behind the Rows. This monster, the true master of Gatlin, had claimed another sacrifice, and the children of the corn would continue their twisted worship, bound to the dark force that ruled their isolated world. As the sun rose over the cornfields, Gatlin remained as it always had, an abandoned town, forgotten by the outside world. But those who knew its secrets, the children who lived in the shadows of the corn, knew the truth. Gatlin belonged to something far older, far darker, than anyone could ever understand, and anyone who ventured too close would never leave. It was a little past midnight, and the long stretch of road seemed to stretch endlessly under the man's headlights. The sky was an inky black, with only the occasional flicker of stars, and the trees on either side of the road stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind. He had been driving for hours, his mind wandering, when he spotted something ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. As his car drew closer, he realized it was a young woman, barely in her 20s, dressed in a beautiful white dress. She stood in the dim glow of a street lamp, her thumb out in the universal gesture for a hitchhike. The man hesitated for a moment. It wasn't often he picked up strangers, especially this late at night, but there was something about her, an air of innocence, maybe, or perhaps it was the lonely look in her eyes. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and pulled over. The girl approached the car with a soft smile, her white dress fluttering slightly in the breeze. She had long, dark hair that framed her pale face, and her eyes sparkled in the moonlight. "Need a ride?" the man asked, rolling down the window. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice soft and melodic. "I'm trying to get home." She slid into the passenger seat, and they set off down the quiet road. The car's interior filled with the faint scent of lilacs, though the man couldn't quite place where the smell was coming from. As they drove, they struck up a conversation, talking about everything from music to places they had traveled. She had a charming way about her, effortlessly keeping the conversation flowing, and the man found himself drawn to her despite the odd circumstances. When they reached her home, a quaint old house at the edge of town, she thanked him warmly and stepped out of the car. She waved as she walked up the path to the front door, and he watched her until she disappeared inside. He thought no more of it as he drove off into the night, feeling oddly pleased with the encounter. But the next morning, as he got into his car to head to work, he noticed something in the passenger seat. A light gray sweater. It was delicate, soft, and clearly belonged to the girl he had given a ride the night before. She must have forgotten it in her hurry to get home, he thought. Deciding to be a gentleman, he made a mental note to return it to her on his way to work. Later that day, he found himself driving back toward her house. It wasn't far out of the way, and he figured it would be a quick stop. He pulled up to the house and rang the doorbell, the sweater folded neatly in his hand. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, her face lined with age and her hair tied in a loose bun. "Good afternoon," the man began, offering a polite smile. "I gave a young lady a ride last night, your daughter, I believe, and she left this sweater in my car." The old woman's expression changed, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him with a puzzled frown. "You must be mistaken," she said slowly, her voice quiet but firm. "No, I'm sure of it," the man insisted. "She told me this was her home. I dropped her off here late last night. She was wearing a white dress, and we had a really nice conversation. She left this sweater behind." The old woman's face paled at his words, and her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the door. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at him as if she were seeing something that wasn't there. "I'm sorry," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "but you're mistaken. My daughter, she passed away 2 years ago." The man blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "I just saw her last night. She was sitting right here in my car." The old woman's eyes filled with sadness as she stepped back from the door, shaking her head slowly. "My daughter was killed in a car accident on this very road 2 years ago. She used to hitchhike home from her friend's place. It was a rainy night, and the driver, he didn't see her in time. Her voice cracked as she spoke. She never made it home. The man felt the blood drain from his face. His hands shook as he glanced down at the sweater in his hand, the delicate fabric now feeling like lead in his grip. His mind raced. How could this be possible? He had spoken to her. She had been real as any other person he had ever met. They had talked, laughed, and he had dropped her off at this very house. That can't be right, he whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. She was. She was real. The old woman gave him a long, sorrowful look before gently closing the door, leaving him standing there on the doorstep, the eerie weight of her words pressing down on him. He stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, his mind spinning in disbelief. Slowly, he turned and walked back to his car, the sweater still clutched in his hands. The drive to work was a blur, the road seeming to stretch on endlessly before him. But all he could think about was the girl in the white dress, the girl who couldn't have been there. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to make sense of what had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cemetery he had passed on his way home, the one not far from the house where he had dropped her off. Could it be possible? Could she have been a ghost? Unable to sleep, he got up and dressed, driven by a strange compulsion to return to that road. The night was eerily silent as he drove, the trees casting long shadows across the deserted street. He parked near the cemetery and got out, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The gate to the cemetery creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the rows of gravestones. He wandered among them, his heart racing, until he found what he was looking for, a simple headstone, weathered and worn, with a name that made his blood run cold. It was her name, the girl in the white dress. The date on the stone confirmed it. She had died exactly 2 years ago to the day. He stood there, staring at the grave, the cold seeping into his bones. He thought of the old woman's words, the sadness in her eyes, and the sweater still lying on the passenger seat of his car. A chill ran down his spine as the realization settled in. He had given a ride to a ghost. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and for just a moment he thought he heard a voice. A soft, familiar voice, thanking him for the ride. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.